So what's the basis for the parameters that we're checking? Usually it's from a guideline requirement, and that's drawing on either design guidelines or another source. So it's probably worth saying that the design guidance for South Australia, there isn't a lot of material in that gives us a basis for setting parameter ranges. So what we've had to do is suggest some parameter ranges within the modelling guidelines for what's reasonable or what you perhaps should be setting as a guideline. So what we've got is we've got a guideline requirement where we're saying this is a hard limit. You really shouldn't be deviating from this unless you've got a good reason. We've got what we've called an internal guideline requirement, which is a guideline that's been set in the modelling, in the South Australia music modelling guidelines, but isn't necessarily, you know, a design requirement outside those. And then we've got what are just recommendations, and that's really just saying this is what we typically expect to see. This is a default parameter. We don't expect people to change this unless they've got a really good reason, or this is just, you know, a common or typical range for, you know, a depth in a system or something else, just so that anything that's really weird and wonderful gets flagged, and you can go and have a closer look and think about whether that's sensible in that particular context. Basically what sitting behind the auditor, what we have is a set of parameter ranges and a series of checks of equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, etc. And we have one of those for each of the different treatments that sits in music, and then each of the different catchments. And then if there's different versions of guidelines, we have a different set for each of those guidelines. So that's all it's doing. It's not rocket science. The original auditor was built in Excel, and obviously we've converted it to a web tool now to make it a bit easier for people to access and use. Okay, I've pretty much covered that. Jumping ahead of myself. Really, I guess I've said it a couple of times, but this idea that anything that gets flagged by the auditor, that's something that the assessor should be looking at and reviewing and thinking about. That said, if you're a consultant and something's getting flagged and you can easily get it within the ranges, it's probably easier to get it within compliance if you can. But if you think you've got a good reason for setting it, then put that justification to the authority and let them make a decision on it. So that's the basic how does it work and how to use it. But probably the important and the interesting and the more challenging part is how do we interpret what comes out of it. I'll just pause again for any questions from arising from that to date. Have we got slide 3090 regarding? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gabriel. I'll have a look at that and review those. I'll talk through those templates in a second. Yep, okay. So that's probably a good time to talk about climate data. So at the moment, the music auditor is set up to expect one of 4 climate templates for use in South Australia. These have been established through the music guidelines. So what we've done is looked at the rainfall right across, well, actually right across the state, but we've developed four rainfall templates for different areas across the Adelaide metropolitan region that can be used. These parameters, these templates have been established with infilled rainfall. So where possible, we've infilled each of the stations with surrounding stations to fill in any gaps or potential issues that might be in them. And then we've selected a period of 10 years of data that is representative of the long-term average, taking into account all of the daily rainfall gauges across the region to calculate that average. So it's a fairly robust process that's been gone through to establish these templates. So on that basis, I'd suggest making use of them where you can. At the same time, I'm conscious that some councils have their own templates that they've developed that they want people to use within their particular area. Don't have a problem with that and happy for them to do that. And some consultants will want to establish their own templates that are tailored for specific areas. And again, that should be considered on its merits. But the auditor basically will check whether the template used fits one of these four at the present time, and it will flag it if it fails that check. It'll check whether the rainfall and the EVAP data match. It'll check the start and end dates, and it will check the time step is 6 minutes. And essentially, if any of these fail, it will flag it. And so in practice, what you tend to find is people are either using the template or they're not. So you'll get something like this, and everything will get flagged if they're using something different, or it'll pass everything if they're using it. But if, let's say, for example, someone decides to set up a template that's the exact same period, but they're not using the infield rainfall, then that will get picked up and it'll recognize that the mean annual rainfall is not matching what we expected. So that's your level of checking. I will add that we are open to new templates being added. If there are councils or regions outside that area that have their own templates that they would like to be included, it's not a big deal for us to add that into what's checked in the music auditor. So do let us know if you have other templates. When would you accept a variation from that? So I would suggest that the obvious is all the regions outside that Adelaide metro area where you don't have a template, then obviously people are not going to pass that test and they're going to have their own template. What I would look for in that case is that the consultant has done their homework, that they've worked out a mean annual rainfall for the site for either the long term or they've done it for a lengthy recent period, that they've chosen something, a 6 minute rainfall period that's then representative of that, and preferably using a minimum of 10 years of data or 20 years of data, depending on the purpose. And finally, that data that they've had a look and made sure that it hasn't got 4-month gaps with no rainfall and things like that in it, that they've actually had a look through, made sure it's got minimal gaps or that they've infilled it. There's a little more on this in the guidelines that you can refer to if need be. So, okay, that's it for climate. I'll just have a look. Gabriel's just flagging there was a difference between what was on the screen and what was on the MRT I sent through for Adelaide, Kent Town. Is that a difference in the mean annual rainfall or is it in the description of it? Gabriel, sorry. Okay, we might come back to that one. And yeah. Jude is
sorry about that.
Sorry, Gabriel.
Yeah, it was just taking too long to type. Yeah, if you go back to slide 30, the bottom line regarding the node playground does not have any errors. Node 13, yours comes up with the right there, the bottom.
Yep.
The bottom node playground node 13.
Yep.
There's a slight difference there. I wasn't sure if you were using Melbourne parameters or South Australia parameters for that one though.
Yep. Okay. Sorry, on the file I've sent you, that's flagging it. Is that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
It's not flagging it on ours, but it's flagging it. Looks like it's flagging it on yours.
Yep. Yeah. You're correct. Yeah, I think that's just I brought in the screenshot before I brought in your local rainfall data into that model. So, yep. I think that's all. Yep. That's okay. And sorry, a question from Jude is it mandatory to include a auditor report in the music essay in the South Australia Music Modelling Guidelines? We have at the end of the guideline, we've given some recommendations around submission. So we have provided a list of things to submit with a music modeler, which includes a report outlining the rationale for it and providing a summary of the inputs. And we have included in that, from memory, that the music summary report is included. But certainly as an authority, I would say you're well within your rights to ask people to provide that summary report file. If not, and you've got music, obviously you can generate it yourself. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? I'll push on. Okay, so catchments is essentially your source nodes in music represent your catchments. So in terms of what we check for that, we run through a relatively small, relatively small number of checks. That the first one we check is just that the catchment isn't 1 hectare. 1 hectare is the default for music, and that in practice, catchments are almost never 1 hectare exactly, but it isn't uncommon for people to accidentally forget to type in the area, which can create a pretty large error in your model, obviously. Not something you should see very often, but we have seen it. More importantly, we've got the soil moisture storage capacity and the field capacity. At the moment, we've got them set to check what's in the proposed guideline. Now, these parameters, these are the e-water recommended soil moisture storage capacity and field capacity for South Australia or for Adelaide. So at the moment, that's what's proposed to go in the guideline, but it is pending decision by the committee. There's a couple other possibilities there under consideration. For all of the other soil parameters in music, the general expectation is that most of the time they will all be at their defaults. So all we're doing is we're checking all of those parameters are defaults. So obviously if someone's changing things, you'll probably get either all or nothing there. Either it'll flag none of them or it'll flag all of those parameters. We then check the pollutant concentrations, and again, we're looking to see that they're the defaults in music, or alternately, that they correspond to a particular surface type that's been set out in the guidelines. And the guidelines provide for different surface types, including roof, road, and general impervious or pervious, and then they have a set of pollutant concentrations for each of those. So if someone's using those parameters, then we let them go through as well. I'll just flag that at the moment, we're not checking for the range of different land uses, but we're going to look at potentially adding that as well, so that if they're using one of the land uses with concentrations set out in the guidelines, it'll let them through as well. That's enough on that. So in the modelling guidelines, there's 2 approaches set out for catchments. One is the lumped or the land use approach, mostly used for using larger models, and then there's also the split surface type, or the basically breaking it up by road, roof, and general, as I just described. So users can choose to use one or the other of these approaches, essentially. When would you use surface type? You would use surface type where you've got a catchment that's very strongly oriented towards one particular surface type. The obvious example being, you're modelling rain gardens with road catchments, and that's pretty much all your catchment is. Then it would be a good idea to start to make use of that road surface type. The other situation where I would lean towards using surface type is where you have rainwater tanks which are catching runoff from roofs and treating that. Obviously, the amount of sediment coming off the roof is going to be much less than what's coming off other surfaces. So if your treatment train's relying heavily on those rainwater tanks, then modelling those catchments just as a mixed surface type will tend to overstate the pollutant treatment performance. So it's better in that case to be using split roof and road and so forth. So the parameters for these, no, I haven't got them. Actually, I'll come back to concentrations in a minute. So in terms of soil parameters, on the left, these are the parameters that music takes as inputs, and this is a conceptual outline of the rainfall runoff model in music. So you have your rainfall threshold is how much water can be stored in an impervious area before it generates runoff. And then you have your pervious store representing any soil or vegetated areas. And the key parameters for that are the soil moisture storage capacity and the field capacity. They're generally the most influential parameters of the various ones representing the pervious store. So they're the most critical ones to get in the ballpark, essentially. The other parameters like infiltration capacity coefficients and initial starting depths and the like, music tends to be a lot less sensitive to those, so they're less critical. More often than not, they're just left at defaults or at some predefined parameters. the ones down the bottom, you've got your groundwater storage, and then you've got controls on how quickly water can get to the groundwater store, the recharge, and then the base flow and deep seepage. If you're dealing with catchments that have a lot of pervious area, it's worth giving a little bit of thought to whether most of your runoff, most of your groundwater will be going to deep seepage and not coming back to your drainage system or waterway, or whether it will be coming out as base flow. But if you're dealing with a catchment that's mostly impervious, the reality is that everything that's going on here in your pervious store will probably not have a lot of effect on your overall model. So you maybe don't need to get too hung up about, you know, whether your base flow is 5% or 10% and the like. So just keep in mind that distinction of sensitivity of models. Mostly urban, don't worry too much about the pervious parameters. If you've got a catchment that's very low impervious, then give them a bit more thought. We do, so this is I guess a typical example of what things might look like with the auditor. So we're checking those soil storage and fill capacity parameters. If people use the defaults in music, they will get flagged under what's currently proposed for the guideline, which means that you'll probably see there's a lot in the short term and until people figure that out, essentially. Just to give you a bit of background on those, we are at present recommending that we use the e-water parameters for Adelaide. One of the reasons for that is that we've looked at the calibrations to catchments done by the Goiter Institute in the technical work that was done underpinning the guidelines, and they came out with fairly similar results, 50 and 40 instead of 40 and 30. We are very conscious that these numbers are a lot lower than what we're seeing for Melbourne. In Melbourne, we've done about 12 calibrations, and they've all come out more like 120 and 80, closer to the defaults in music, in fact. So on the one hand, we're sticking with the data that's local, and the best available information for Adelaide. On the other, I'm a little bit nervous because I'm conscious that when we did the work in Melbourne, that suggested that we should change it quite significantly. I've half a mind to adopt the Victorian parameters, but I think that might be a bit difficult to justify, given that would conflict with the local data. So on this reason, we've gone with the e-water parameters, but yeah, be aware that I do reserve judgment on those a little bit. I'd really love to see some calibrations done for South Australia for a few more catchments to really prove those parameters up better. There is scope if you're not happy with just using the defaults, and I'd particularly commend these for very pervious catchments for people with sandy coastal soils and the like, that you do want to think about changing the soil parameters and adopting something representative of those soils. And what we've offered in the guidelines as a way to do that is the basically the soil parameters developed by Andrew McLeod back in about 2008 based on different soil types and what the soil moisture storage capacities and field capacities should be. And then there's also some guidance in that on what the other corresponding parameters are. So be aware in using these that they're based on physical soil properties. So they give a rational differentiation between different soil types and what the parameters should be. They are, however, not, despite what the paper says, calibrated to music. So they don't necessarily give the answers that you would expect to see for that particular soil type. Now they may not, but that hasn't been tested and proven either way at this point. So again, imperfect, but the best information we have available to give a good basis for varying our soil parameters based on the soil type. So I would recommend using these where you're getting into those conditions where you've got sandy soils, where you've got mostly pervious catchments, and you can be reasonably confident that the sort of basic e-water parameters are not going to be the best representation of those soils. In these kind of conditions though, you really want to be thinking about getting some flow data and doing some calibration if you can. All right, I expect there'll be some questions on that. I'll just talk through what's going on here. I'll just talk you through a couple of possible outcomes for these, and then I'll talk through the pollutant concentrations, and then I'll probably pause there for a discussion because I'm aware that there's lots of things to think about in this section. What you'll probably get pretty frequently is people will give you a model which has got the defaults. Music Auditor will flag those and say they're not in compliance with the guideline. That's fairly straightforward. Go back, change the parameters so that they match the guideline ideally. Second situation you might see is that they've got a roof, it's 100% impervious, the parameters get flagged. Going back to our rainfall runoff model, they've only got impervious area in that catchment, there's no pervious area. So what you set here has no effect whatsoever. So you could go back and make them change the parameters, but the reality is it won't change the model. So you could just go, look, I'm just going to ignore those parameters and move on, and we can all do something else with our time. So use a bit of judgment in reviewing these and considering, you know, is this material, does it actually matter when you're looking at them? Pollutant concentrations, Jude's put through a couple of questions on pollutant concentrations, just asking what we're adopting for that. So what we've got here is the recommended pollutant concentrations in the guidelines for different surface types. And so we've got the road, roof, and all other urban. We've then got a set of pollutant concentrations that can be used for different land uses. So the mixed urban is the default for music, and that's what you'll get if you just create a node. Now, this, in my opinion, honestly, is as good an estimate as any for representing typical urban stormwater runoff. If you've got a catchment that's a variety of things, then that's as good a representation as any of that particular condition. If you've got enough information that you can say exactly what's roof, exactly what's road, and exactly what's something else, then by all means go and use the surface type breakdowns, and that will give greater precision in terms of where those pollutants are coming from, and it will allow you to refine that treatment train so that you're targeting sediment treatment towards the roads, you're not focusing it so much on the roof, that kind of thing. You can tailor that treatment train a bit more. These land uses also cover the non-urban land uses. So if you've got agricultural areas, farming, forest areas, rural, residential, these give you some better pollutant concentrations to represent those areas than using the urban, obviously, and I would commend them to you. Once you get into this breakdown of the urban, to be really honest, these are based on less information than is available for the mixed urban. And I'd be cautious about how different the pollutant concentrations really are between different land uses in urban areas. Are there differences? Probably yes. How certain are we about them? Not nearly so much. So that's my view on those. That said, everyone likes to represent their models as accurately as possible, and they do like to break it down with the land uses. So that's available if you want to use it. At the moment, the auditor is not checking all of these parameters, but I will add them in so that you don't get flagged if you're using some of these parameters that are in the guidelines. So this is our first example. If you'd like to try, and I'll just put that on the side so you can see. If you'd like to try opening up the Music Auditor, and we'll just have a go at uploading a file and see if we can get that to work for everyone. We'll just do the townhouse surface type example. So in the Music Auditor, I'll just choose File. I'll choose that townhouse surface types. Just minimize that chat for a second. Okay, so you should get something like this coming out. So in this particular case, you'll see that it hasn't flagged anything for the pollutant concentrations. They've all passed. It's picked up the area on the townhouse roof is the only thing it's picked up for the catchments. We'll talk about these ones a bit later on. Now, if you go back to the Music Auditor and choose, I've got a second version of this, which is the same the same model, but with the surface types not compliant with the guideline. And if you open that and run it, what you should see is that this time the auditor picks up that, it's picked up a couple of other issues, but it has now picked up the pollutant concentrations, and it's flagged that they're not one of the expected ranges. So it'll pick it up, and you can see here, these are all the different possible outcomes, and this is what's been put in the model. This particular case, yeah, someone has used one of the other music settings, and it doesn't match in with your guidelines. These are actually values that have been taken from New South Wales in this particular case. So, as I mentioned before, these are often all or nothing. So if it fails one, it'll fail all of them. So don't worry that you get a fair bit of text here. Now, I'll just, is everyone able to get the auditor to run and process a file? Okay. Sean's nodding. Just get the chat back up. Yep, Jude's got it working. Gabriel, thanks. Thanks, Daniel. David, all right, great. Harsha, yep, okay. What do we got? All right, nearly everyone's running. Okay. Jude, you had a question on pollutant concentrations. Did you want to ask that, or have I managed to answer that already? Just
Delhi, yeah. So
yeah.
My question is mainly on we have done any research on this, and then are we going to use this in our music guideline? So then everyone using across South Australia.
Yep. Yeah, okay, yep. So yeah, essentially the answer is yes. What we've got is these two tables of pollutant concentrations are now the recommended concentrations to use within South Australia. It is open that you can use the default mixed urban that's in music, which is just basically what it will come up with, or you can put in either the surface type pollutant concentrations or the land use type pollutant concentrations. So these are what we are recommending for use across South Australia now. They're based on the best available information that we have, representing that there's some shortcomings in that and limitations, but it is the best info we've got. Be aware that the parameters in music, I'll just open it up. Just be aware that the parameters that are built into music for different land use surface types, if I just pull up one of these, for example, it's gonna come up. Try another one. Can't find it. Yeah, so be aware that if you use the drop down in music, these are a set of parameters that eWater have taken from the New South Wales music guidelines. There's 2 or 3 mistakes in these. I can't honestly recommend anyone use them at the present time. Hopefully we can get those fixed up in the not too distant future, so at least they're the right numbers. And ideally what I'd like to see is that we've actually got these set up so that it's got all those parameters that you see in the South Australia music guideline, so people can do a drop down and it's got South Australia urban residential, and you can just choose that from that list and pick it up. That's what I'd like to get to in the not too distant future.
So in this case, the music guideline and the music when we download, I mean updating and all that in the from eWater is automatically comes in the music model.
Yeah, it doesn't at the moment, but that's what I would like to get to. So once these guidelines are finalised and published, I think what I'll do is we'll send this to eWater and say, can you give some thought to including this in music so that it's available to people. If they don't, there are other ways. You'll see here I've actually got all the Melbourne Water ones set up in mine. If necessary, it's a bit fiddly, but I can give instructions for people on how to set these up for South Australia, and we can set up some files so that people have that available and they can just use that and go South Australia whichever.
Yeah, but it's
and
going to
pick it
be
up.
difficult
Yeah,
because of the consultants mainly,
Yeah.
you know, if you
work
give a
across.
chart and then
Yep.
you know, put those values into the
Yep.
music, it's better to have it e-water
Built in.
involved and then
Yep.
have a drop-down menu which gives
Yeah.
South Australia. So that's what
Yep.
I suggest. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Jude. I totally agree. Melissa, we might take this up with e-water once we get the guidelines finalised and locked in.
Yes, absolutely. And I've just responded to about the fact that I've been meeting with other national capacity building projects on this very issue about concentrations, and we're looking to try and get a national project up to try and gather all the new data.
Yep. No, that's fantastic. It's become very apparent that that's needed. So
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in these projects, we haven't had the time or the resources to be able to do that justice, to really look at all the data that's available across the country and pull it all together. But it's becoming really, really apparent that that's desperately needed for our industry. So it's good that the capacity building organisations are talking. Okay. Any other questions on concentrations or soil parameters? Alrighty. Yeah, so I guess just to recap, when a variation's okay, is probably the key question that comes up. So I'd say that if you've actually got geotechnical information, you've got specific soil types, and you've got some testing done, and then, you know, especially if it's these very different soil conditions, the default parameters, or the e-water parameters, are basically, it's a clay soil that you might see across many parts of Adelaide. You could expect that those parameters are generally representative of that sort of, you know, hard clay soils, limited amount of infiltration capacity, a fair bit of, you know, fairly easily generate runoff. That's what that's representing. If you've got coastal sandy soils, then I would definitely be looking to use a different set of soil parameters and basing that on what information is available. Ideally, do a calibration, but I'm very conscious that very few people have the flow data to do calibrations. Pollutant concentrations. When would I expect deviations? To be honest, with the guidelines now, we've got the surface type, we've got the land use parameters. That should cover 90 or 95% of what people are trying to do with music, I would expect. I really expect to see them either using the defaults or using some of the parameters in the guidelines. Where you might see variations is two cases. One is where you're trying to model a quarry or something really left field, and you need to use some different parameters to represent that. And the other is where they've actually gone and done a whole heap of testing and monitoring analysis, and then they're trying to represent something specific, and you're using, you know, some actual monitored data to represent that.